Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Julian Zelizer, who's a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, whose recent books include Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of the Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party, and his latest, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement. The co-host of the Politics and Polls podcast and a CNN Political Analyst. His latest article at CNN is Ripping and Burning, How the Trump White House Handled Some Legally Protected Documents. Welcome to Background Briefing, Julian Zelizer.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the House Select Committee have received hundreds of White House records since Trump lost his legal battle at the Supreme Court. And the National Archives have called for call logs and telephone records. But apparently there's no records of calls to and from Trump during the January the 6th riot. So is it possible that he's destroyed those records or perhaps using private cell phones? What's your guess on that?
I don't know which it is. I assume there are calls and communications. He was very active that day, and I think there's going to have to be an investigation. I don't want to speculate as to what happened, but certainly it is suspicious, and those could be right at the center of any effort to understand how exactly January 6th connected to what the president did behind the scenes.
Well, apparently in the official White House call logs, there is some information, but there's a huge gap on the actual day. But at least we know from those logs that on the morning of January the 6th, Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio had a 10-minute phone conversation with President Trump just before Jordan went to the House floor to object to the certification of Joe Biden's electoral win.
Yeah, and Jordan's a key player. There's a number of Republican conservatives who were connections to the Republican caucus. And so I think certainly that's one of the figures we need to know more about, and who had, lived in a close orbit with a lot of the organizations that were involved in the insurrection.
So one of the more extraordinary revelations is coming from a new book by the CNN political analyst Maggie Haberman, who's also the New York Times White House reporter. And she's reporting in her new book that the White House residents would periodically have to bring in a plumber to unclog the toilets because Trump had clogged them with wads of documents, and they had to sort of retrieve these wads of clumped up and wet printed paper. And that's along with other reports that apparently White House aides had to, scotch tape back documents that Trump ripped up. So it sounds like a rather difficult job that Trump has left both White House aides and the National Archives with.
I think that's true from that, from other accounts we're getting from the press. It seems pretty clear this was not a president committed to keeping the records. And this is exactly why we have legislation that stipulates that the records must be preserved. If a president acts this way, we lose any concrete material about how things unfolded. And I think the former president, saw this as he might have seen the business world, where communications can just be destroyed if he didn't find it convenient to keep them. It's not supposed to work that way. But I think that's what Congress is facing. There's going to be a lot of empty boxes and empty spaces.
So in terms of the Presidential Records Act that was signed into law in 1978 by President Jimmy Carter, are there any penalties for Trump's behavior? No,
not really. This is one of the elements of the legislation that has been criticized over time. The enforcement is very weak. It really lays out what you're supposed to do, but then doesn't have any way to make sure you're doing it. We have depended on the good graces of presidents to follow it. The only question is with national security documents. And I know the Justice Department, there was at least a story is looking into this. And I don't know if there's an area where some kind of action could be taken. But presidents, as we see over and over with presidential power, have a lot of leeway to make these decisions and not have any punitive action against them.
Well, apparently you mentioned classified documents, Julian Zelizer. there was a discovery in the 15 boxes of document that were returned to the government last month from Mar-a-Lago that some of those documents appear to have classified information in them. So who's actually doing the detective work here?
Well, I'm sure the National Archives is looking into this. I'm sure the Department of Justice, from what we hear, is at least setting into place potential investigations. And I don't know what Congress will do. I mean, this is an oversight question where Congress, the House, should have the ability and willingness, more importantly, to continue pursuing where this all went. It might be there, it's gone. It might be it's literally down the toilet. But I think all three different elements of this, National Archives, Congress, and Justice, need to understand this more, especially since these are not documents that we're talking about that might have been accidentally removed or that don't really deal with a central issue. We're talking about documents in part that might tell us more about January 6th and documents that might be very relevant and important for other national security questions.
And again, I'm speaking with Julian Zelizer, who's a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, whose recent books include Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of the Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party, and his latest book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement. The co-host of the Politics and Polls podcast and a CNN political analyst, his latest article at CNN is Ripping and Burning, How the Trump White House Handled Some Legally Protected Documents. So apparently, after a lengthy back and forth between lawyers, Trump's lawyers and the National Archives National Archives did get a dozen boxes of these materials that I mentioned. Among them were the original version of the letter that former President Barack Obama had left for Mr. Trump when he was sworn in. And then, of course, there were the love letters between Trump and the North Korean Kim Jong-un, and also the map of Hurricane Dorian heading towards Alabama with Trump's black Sharpie additions to the map. So how would you rate that kind of material in terms of getting a full presidential record for historians? And you're a presidential historian.
Well, my starting point always is all material can be relevant. We don't know at the time what becomes significant. It's impossible to gauge what different kinds of historians are going to want to look at. So that's why the default should be keep everything. And obviously things could be classified. They're already preserved for 12 years before we get to look at them. But you can't selectively figure out what will be important in the future. But certainly we don't need to even wait to understand the communication of one president to the other is not something that we should lose, or the communication between a president and another foreign leader with regard to North Korea. These can be incredibly valuable. Even that map was a part of his presidency. It can get us into understanding how he handled the media and issues involving national crises and environmental crises. So we just have to assume all of that will be important at some point, and that's why it's so dangerous to see a president try to take some of this or get rid of it altogether.
Well, this is yet another norm, is it not, that Trump has violated?
It's exactly right. I mean, it's connected to other stories we followed during the Trump presidency, where we learn that law doesn't always constrain a president, nor does oversight. And sometimes what we depend on are norms that presidents follow. Even the most partisan of presidents have to have some kind of limitations. And this story about what he appears to be willing to do with his documents, both while he was in the White House and now, is another norm he just doesn't follow. And I think his assumption, which might be right, is there's not a lot of political fallout or any kind of penalty for doing this. And so it's very dangerous. The more this becomes a precedent, the more other presidents are going to say, you know, we don't have to keep this record. Let's find a way to get rid of it. And this all stems, of course, if we remember, from Richard Nixon and the erasure of a key tape during the Watergate hearings, which ultimately was a big reason why we have this law to start. And Nixon tried to protect his papers after leaving the presidency. So this is going back to Nixon and seeing the former President Trump learn the wrong lessons from that period.
But so far, Trump seems to have been incredibly successful in breaking the norms of when a president is defeated, he goes off into retirement and writes his memoirs. Former President Trump hasn't gone away. His Stop the Steal lie has metastasized into the Republican Party's almost platform for 2022 and 2024. The RNC recently described the January the 6th insurrection as legitimate political discourse. So the GOP is almost endorsing political violence, and the massive amount of voter suppression that's going on would indicate that it's a very good chance that Trump could get reelected, not by fair means, but by foul means in 2024.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm in agreement with everything you said. He remains in strong standing. It doesn't seem to me that he's feeling or facing any kind of serious threat at this point, meaning as a result of what he's done and the norms he's broken. And it's very clear that he and the Republican Party are generally on the same page. And even Senator McConnell's recent comments that were stronger, of course, on January 6th don't really persuade me that the party is anywhere close to wanting to do something about it. And as McConnell has said himself, that he will support Trump if he's the nominee. So there's a lot of reason why Trump feels freedom to flout norms because there's no penalty for doing so, and his own party stands 95% behind him.
Well, it's having an effect as we speak, though. The new German chancellor was at the White House a few days ago, and President Biden kept emphasizing that if the Russians invade, if the tanks cross the border into Ukraine, he will kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And Scholz was asked the same thing, and he didn't entirely agree or endorse exactly what the president was saying because he's in a difficult spot because of German domestic politics. And apparently, one of the reasons why Scholz, who's in a coalition government, is in a bit of a spot in terms of German domestic politics is that the Germans and the French and others in Europe are sort of not so much hedging their bets, but they're thinking, Trump can come back. It's already having an effect on foreign policy, apparently.
Right. Even in this post-presidential period, my guess is after watching Trump hold office and seeing the outcome of 2020, where Biden won, but it was not the kind of margins some expected. I'm sure many European leaders are assuming, like many political observers here in the U.S., that there is a viable path for a second Trump term. And they might be basing some of their decisions on foreign policy accordingly. I think that's a great way to gauge overseas how people are thinking about this. And the leaders are not assuming this is just inevitably a one-term presidency.
So Joe Biden's proclamation when he first took over, America is back, that's even been undermined.
Correct. And some of it is obviously mistakes many would argue that Biden has made, but a big part of it is the continued shadow of Donald Trump, which I think looms large over the United States, over its political system, and over the way leaders overseas are trying to make calculations about what to do and thinking who will be president in January 2025. And many are not saying with certainty that it won't be President Trump, which means from their perspective, a lot of the key alliances can still be threatened and as weak as they had been in the last 4 years.
So just in the last couple of minutes, Julian Zelizer, back to the National Archives. There's another issue involving the National Archives, and that is the certification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And a number of Democratic senators and two Republican senators, Murkowski and Collins, the two women, are urging, along with the Democrats, the National Archives to publish the ERA as the latest amendment to the United States Congress. But they're being opposed in particular by 3 Republican senators, Rob Portman, Ron Johnson, and Mitt Romney. So where does that stand, and who's got a case here?
I actually haven't even heard about this story, so it's breaking news as we speak, and I have to look a little bit more at what happened before I'd have a comment.
Right. Well, it is extraordinary that how long it's taken to get the ERA ratified.
I just taught a class about the 1970s where we're talking about this huge push where 35 states moved pretty quickly to ratify it, but then a conservative mobilization by Phyllis Schlafly and some others on the right stopped it before it was ratified, and it's been in limbo ever since. And in some ways, it's interesting because it was one of the first major successes of this new conservative movement that set the foundation ultimately for the Trump presidency.
And that's the movement that you wrote about in your book, Burning Down the House?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So just in the last minute then, an overview from you about whether or not the Democrats can make some kind of, not so much a comeback, but at least hold the line in 2022. It feels to me, with the massive voter suppression going on and the gerrymandering and the ability the Republican legislatures have to, if they don't like the results, they can overturn them. At the very least, they'll be mired in court battles and possibly even street violence, given the kind of incendiary rhetoric coming from Trump and others, and the kind of people that stormed the Capitol on January the 6th. Is it possible that the Democrats can start a popular movement to save American democracy, to get the vote out from a lot of people that don't normally vote? The Democrats have to have 8% more votes now just to break even with the Republicans. But now, if you add in the voter suppression, they've got to really mobilize. And can they do it?
It's certainly going to be hard by the midterms. I do think it's possible for voting rights groups to mobilize and to have effect. That was the story of the early 1960s. Voting rights, the legislation of 65, didn't come out of Congress automatically. It came out of a Congress where there was pressure coming from below. But this is a big push. The conservatives are just as mobilized at this point, if not more mobilized, behind the voter restriction. So that's one of the big challenges. I think realistically, Democrats would hope that by 2024, they could get a big get out the vote mobilization. I'm not sure it's possible by November 2022. The midterms look very difficult. I think that the biggest thing would not be voter mobilization. It would be somehow such an easing of the pandemic and strong economic conditions combined with that fewer voters want to change status of Congress. But I think Democrats are probably going to be looking at losses, and the question is, how bad are the losses?
Well, Julian Zelizer, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Julian Zelizer, who's a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, whose recent books include Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of the Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party, and his latest, Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement. And he's the co-host of the Politics and Polls podcast and a CNN Political Analyst, where his latest article is Ripping and Burning, How the Trump White House Handled Some Legally Protected Documents. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the resignation from the Facebook board of the billionaire Trump ally Peter Thiel, who is now directing his fortune to get Trumpster candidates elected to the House and Senate.